Welcome back. This is Section 4, Restructuring an App with Blueprints. Last section, we covered the more advanced features of Jinja, the templating library for Flask. Using these features, we created the first full prototype of our web app. This section will cover what a blueprint is in Flask and how it can be used to simplify our code. Then we will adopt a new folder structure for our application that will aid us in maintaining the code base. This video is the first video of Section 4, titled Creating Flask Blueprints. In this video, we will cover what a blueprint is and how to use them in our project. So, what is a blueprint? You can think of blueprint as a mini application object. While they do not have all the functionality of an actual application object, blueprints allow you to register routes to them, which gives you the ability to share common attributes between them, like a separate template folder, a separate static folder, or a common URL prefix. Now, blueprints are named blueprints because they can be registered to an application object many times by giving the blueprint different parameters to make sure the URLs don't collide. This is not a functionality that we will use in this course, but its implementation will be clear when we cover application factories in the next video. So, let's create the blueprints that our application will use for the rest of the series. Our blog and post routes logically go together, so it would make sense to group them into a blueprint to separate them from the rest of the routes. The rest of the routes will be grouped into the main blueprint. The blueprints will define folders to hold the templates of the routes, that is a subfolder to the main templates folder. Also, all of the routes under the blog blueprint will have the /blog prefix attached to the defined URL. To attach routes to the blueprint, simply replace the app in @app.route with the new blueprint object. Since we specified URL prefix for blog blueprint, we also need to remove /blog from the route decoder. Now that the blog routes and main routes are registered on the blueprint, we have to change all the URL_for calls we made to these routes in the templates. This is because the routes are not in the global application scope anymore, and we must specify that the route we want is under a blueprint. This is done by simply prepending the name of the blueprint to the wanted route with a period. Let's go ahead and change all the calls to the URL_for function in our templates. The last change we have to make to the code is to register the blueprints down at the bottom of the code and import blueprints from Flask. Okay, everything is set up for the blueprints. Great. Let's test it out. As you can see, nothing has changed. And we see an error. This is because we specified incorrect blueprint in the URL_for function. Let's change it, and let's test it out again. Great! Now we've fixed our mistake, and everything seems to work just as expected. Awesome! So what did we cover in this video? We learned what a blueprint is and how it can apply attributes to many different routes. We also saw how to create these routes in our code and how to add them to the app object. In the next video, we will use the blueprints we have created to clean up our code and make it more maintainable. This is going to be video 2 of Section 4, Restructuring Our Files. In the previous video, we covered what Flask Blueprint is and how to use it to share common attributes between similar routes. In this video, we will use the Flask blueprints we created in the previous video to modularize our code and clean it up by separating it into separate folders and files. This will make it easier to add new features going forward and to maintain our code in the future. We will also add a configuration system which will allow our app to easily transition between different environments, as well as make the unit testing easier later in the course. Our application has gone from a very simple example to an extendable foundation on which powerful features can easily be built. However, having our application entirely reside in one file needlessly clutters our code. To make the application code clearer and more comprehensible, we will transform all of the code into a Python package and split the code into multiple files. The current slide shows the current format of our code, and this is what our code will look like after we are done. What this format allows is having the application object in a central location in the declaration of a package. It also allows the Flask extensions to be initialized and configured outside of the file in which the application object is initialized, separating the concerns of each file in the project. The file name _init_.py looks odd, but it has a specific function. In Python, a folder can be marked as a package by placing a file called _init_.py inside of it. This allows programs to import objects and variables from the Python files in the folder. This special file can be empty or can contain code, which will be run every time a file is imported from the package. The first change is to create a folder in your application directory that will hold the module. In this example, it will be called WFDB, but can be called anything except for blog or main because controllers have those names. For example, if there are two blog objects to import from, Python will not import objects correctly from the parent directory while importing inside the blog.py file. Next, move the static and template folders into a new directory along with the app.py file. We need a directory to hold the views, and let's create a main.py file and a blog.py file inside of it, as well as a _init_.py file, which we will keep empty. We will also need to create the files forms.py, models.py, and config.py in the project folder. Also, the app.py file will need to be renamed _init_.py. Now we need to start moving the code from our _init_.py file to the other files. First, cut all the SQL Alchemy code along with the imports and move it into the models.py file. And because we don't have the application object available, we need to delete the app parameter that is passed to the SQL Alchemy object. We will register our application object with SQL Alchemy in the _init_.py file to avoid circular imports. Secondly, do the same for our form objects by placing them into the forms.py file. Thirdly, cut all of the main _blueprint object code along with all the routes attached to it. And place it into the main.py file under the controllers folder. Also, the templates folder path on the blueprint declaration is relative, so prepend the following to fix the import. And now, we can do the same process for the blog_blueprint object. Next, take the configuration declarations from _init_.py and move them to config.py. In order to create the configuration system we described at the start of this video, we need to encapsulate our configuration variables inside of objects. Flask has a method to read configuration variables from an object rather than from a directory. This will allow us to create polymorphic configurations, meaning we can have a base configuration with other configurations deriving from it, like a development configuration and a production configuration. To do this, remove the code that accesses the dictionary and just assign values to variables with the names of the old dictionary keys. Now move the debug and SQL Alchemy URI declarations to a dev_config object, which will inherit from the base config object. And let's also create a production configuration object, which we will use much later in the course. The last change to the application code is in the _init_.py file As we mentioned before, we also have to initialize the database object in our app. To do this, we will use the init_app method of the database object in the _init_.py file. Finally, we have to change the imports of the manage.py file, which is a quick fix. Let's move the SQLite database file to WFDB folder. Okay, so our code is now back to a state where it can be run again. So if we go to our web browser and test out the code, we can see that absolutely nothing visually has changed. Awesome! This is going to be a common theme for this section. While nothing has changed visually, our code has already gotten into a much more understandable and clean state. But we can take this a step further. Currently, our configuration object is passed as a string in the _init_.py file. If we instead changed our code so that our application object was created inside a factory method, we could pass a configuration object into the method, creating a customized application object. For those of you who are unaware of some of the more advanced concepts in object-oriented programming, factory method is any function that creates an object. This is rather simple to implement. Just indent all the current code, replace the string in the configuration method with a variable name, and add the variable name to the function definition. What this allows us to do is easily switch between configuration objects. For example, when we switch from production to development environments, we can easily change the configuration object that is passed and change the behavior of our app. Also, we need to change manage.py file again in order to run our app. As you can see, the code for creating an application object with our new factory method is as simple as it gets. And if we check the browser again, we can see that our app is the same as it was before, visually speaking. Great, isn't it? So, what have we accomplished in this section? We have made our application structure much more modular and, as a result, maintainable. And in future videos, we will make them testable as well. We have also made it much easier to move our applications to new environments by creating a new configuration system with the application factory method. Going forward, adding new features through new Flask extensions will be made much easier through the new project format. In the next section, we will look at one such extension, Flask Login, to add a login system to our app.